Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar. It's National Hedgerow Week and we are delighted that you are joining us. There will be a few seconds of just blathering while we just let you all establish and arrive. At the bottom of the screen, as usual with all webinars, there is two buttons. There's a Q&A button where you can pose your questions to any of our panelists today. And there's also a chat button. So while we're getting started, maybe you'd just like to tell us where you're all from, because potentially there's an awful lot of you out there today. And so in the chat, if you just want to tell us where you're all from, we can get a sense of all over the country where you might be. So we've got people from, hello, Luke, you were first up, Yorkshire and Herefordshire and Norfolk and Somerset and Plymouth and Wiltshire and all sorts of places, Edinburgh, all over the country, Bedfordshire, Kent, Somerset, Wiltshire. Anybody from outside of these four shores? Deepest, darkest Devon and Reading and Bath and Cheshire. We also have just lost one of our panelists whose computer just glitched at the very last second, everybody. So while you're doing this, we're just I'm just flanneling while we're letting them rejoin. And Kaylee, if you can just please watch out for Pippa rejoining. It's National Hedgerow Week, and this is the week where we start to celebrate the importance of hedges to our nation, to the countryside, to our landscape. And we thought this for the first one of our sessions this week, we thought it would be quite interesting to explore the future of hedges and the sort of cutting edge of that by talking to some people who are actively researching in the field of hedgerows, or have been actively researching in the field of hedgerows. And I'm delighted to be joined by Pippa, Professor Pippa Chapman, who has just disappeared because, as I said, her laptop's just melted at the wrong moment, but she was there about 2 minutes ago, and hopefully she will be back in a second. Dr. Sofia Biffi, who is an environmental scientist from Aarhus University in Denmark, and she's been working on hedges here for a long time. Dr. Josh Wolstenholme, who is from, he's a research fellow at Loughborough and did work on automatic hedgerow gap recognition and all sorts of really clever stuff that we helped Josh with, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, which was great. And Abhishek Dixit, who is a new researcher just getting into his PhD, and he's looking at the nature of Cornish hedges and what a Cornish hedge is all about. And so that's our panel for today, and we are going to explore some of the issues that are going on in the academic and research world with regard to hedges. We were going to start with Pippa, who was going to give us our first introduction, but what we'll do, maybe Sofia, do you mind leading us off? And hopefully at some point Pippa will get back in.
I'm sure she'll be back soon.
Yeah, okay, so thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm very excited to be here. First of all, it's always good to have Hedgerow Week. My background is in ecology. I came to the UK 10 years ago to study a master in biodiversity conservation, and then I went on to do a PhD that had to do a lot with sustainable soil management practices for farmland birds. And we were looking at cover crops and organic soil amendments. And by the end of my PhD, I really wanted to focus on something a bit more narrow, a bit more specific. So when Pippa and our colleague Guy Ziv approached me asking me if I would be interested in doing a postdoc on hedgerows, I was like, oh, this is great. Such a simple, specific topic. And then it turns out that it's probably one of the broadest ecosystems that you might be able to work in an agricultural setting in England, just because it's at the interface of so many different things. Because you've got, of course, agricultural production, and then you have biodiversity, but you also have aspects of carbon storage, of hydrology. So during the next 3.5 years, we essentially worked a lot on hedgerows. And it came at a time where not a lot was known about them, but everybody was starting to really talk more and more about hedges. There was quite a lot of pressure coming, especially from the climate change mitigation point of view, because the Climate Change Committee had inserted hedges are quite an important step in contributing towards climate change mitigation, but they had attributed to them a value of carbon sequestration that was based on a very small amount of literature. And so we figured we could improve on that, and in the meantime also look at all these other ecosystem services that hedges can provide. So it was really fun. And then in the end, my career has brought me now to Denmark. And I've been working on a slightly different topic for a little bit, but I'm trying now really hard to bring hedges to Denmark, because much like in the UK, this country has seen a huge decline in hedgerow length over the past few decades, because they really have been focusing a lot on agricultural productivity, so on very intensive, especially arable land. And I can bring all the wealth of knowledge that I was able to acquire in the UK and try to expand it in other areas of Northern Europe.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Sofia. Pippa, I did explain that you were having computer meltdown problems at exactly the wrong moment. So it's I hope you're not too stressed by the last 5 minutes. So everybody, this is Professor Pippa Chapman, who will explain a bit about what she does. So Pippa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And yes, of course, computer technology meltdown, just computer froze, but here we are. It's lovely to join you all and to talk about hedgerows, which I suppose I've been studying for the last 10 years. And my background is actually as a soil scientist. I'm a professor of soil science at the School of Geography in the University of Leeds, and I've been here for over 25 years. And I suppose hedgerows found me. I wasn't really going out to study hedgerows initially. It wasn't something that I thought I would look at. I was very interested in soil and the functions that soil, soil functions and the delivery of different ecosystem services. And I was involved with a project called Soil Biohedge about 10 years ago, which was based at the University of Leeds Farm and a collaboration between Sheffield, Leeds and York. And really, we were looking at the roles of hedgerows and particularly soil hedgerow, soil below hedgerows, and how that might benefit agricultural fields. And a little bit what Sofia said, I think we were quite amazed to realise that there wasn't really that much known about soils beneath hedgerows. We perhaps focused on the above ground biodiversity when we think about hedgerows, but as Sofia said, hedgerows deliver lots of other benefits. And so in this project, we started looking at, the different properties of soil. We're looking at the earthworms and the fungi beneath in the soil. We were looking at the hydrological properties of soil and the nutrient and water quality. So we were really looking and quantifying for the first time some of these areas that hadn't been looked at. And I really enjoyed that project. And then I think Sofia perhaps mentioned that we had another research project working with farmers in Cumbria, particularly dairy farmers, actually, that were being encouraged to plant hedgerows. And they wanted to know more about the benefits that hedgerows delivered. And that's when I started working with Sofia and others, Guy and Rich at Leeds, and looking at quantifying particularly their carbon benefit and also their biodiversity benefit and their hydrological functioning. So what would their role be in flood mitigation, climate mitigation, and I suppose air pollution and things like this. So I've had students look at the role of hedgerows in capturing pollution from cars and then improving, I suppose, reducing that pollution. And I think, like Sofia said, it's been so great over the last 10 years while I've been studying hedgerows to see the interest in hedgerows grow. And I think one area that I've really enjoyed is working with others to share the knowledge that we've been gaining with farmers, but also the public and other stakeholders that are involved. So So really enjoyed that aspect, and it's great to be here in National Hedgerow Week. And as you know, John, 2 years ago, we held an event at the University of Leeds and welcomed you and others, and really pleased to be here to talk about hedgerows. So thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. We will get to you. We will get collectively to question all of these good people as we go through this event. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box on the screen. And our next of our panel today is Dr. Josh Wolstenholme. Josh, introduce yourself to everybody.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. So I'm Josh. I'm a research fellow out of Loughborough University. And I think I'm the kind of only imposter as part of this group, because my main research interest is on river systems and how they change throughout time. But I kind of got interested in hedgerows through working with people like John, who kindly funded our research project that I'm kind of here to talk about from a more landscape perspective. So how we can use things like aerial imagery and machine learning to be able to identify different hedgerows. And I've got some dreaded slides, which if I can find them, to show people just to help illustrate this point. So this is a painting by David Hockney that was of the East Riding of Yorkshire. And what we can see in kind of the foreground here in the background is there's lots of agricultural fields, and we see that there's lots of hedgerows here that split up these different field margins. And there's lots of different trees, farm buildings in the background and all that good stuff. And one thing that we kind of notice in this foreground bit here is there are lots of different gaps between these different hedgerows. And mapping the absence of something is relatively difficult and not that straightforward, but it's super important for hedgerow connectivity. You know, it provides habitat for wildlife as well as acts as landscape corridors. But on top of that, these gaps also provide access for farmers to be able to get to different fields and for different mammals to traverse between them. But on the ground, they look quite different in reality. So we have a Cornish hedge on the right here and one from the East Riding on the left, albeit in winter, and they're very different. And they look very different from the painting. They're not these big green luscious things. But when we look at them from a landscape perspective, we can't rely on this kind of close on kind of physical at a ground level data. It's just not enough for us to be able to map these at large scale. So we have to turn to aerial imagery or satellite imagery, where they look completely different yet again. And here's some pictures that are linked to this paper that myself and colleagues wrote at the beginning of the year. Basically, we have these different hedgerows across the region, but we have no way of mapping them beyond using elevation data. And we wanted to challenge that a little bit and see how we could identify these gaps and differentiate between them so that colleagues can identify prioritization areas, or we can understand where we need to put more effort into planting. And the way in which we approach this is through using a machine learning model. So it uses deep learning, which basically means myself and a bunch of colleagues manually drew around about 32 kilometers of hedgerow, and we trained this model to be able to identify it in the same way as you learn when you're a child. You get taught that a car is a car, and then you get more specific, whether it's a pickup truck. We could teach the model what a hedgerow was, and through that we were able to extract what a gap for access was, so one that couldn't be planted in effectively, and what we called unutilized gaps, so these gaps that present planting opportunities for more habitats. And when we look at it at the landscape scale, we can see that there's a variety of density across the region. So we have dense hedgerows along here, along the wolds of East Riding of Yorkshire, which is higher elevation land, and we have fewer hedgerows where it's more urban, which is to be expected. But in terms of the gap density, we see that this is variable across the region. So it's really important for us to be able to do this large scale mapping, which is kind of where my main interest lies, and understand the different methods and techniques that we can do to produce these kind of data for other people to be able to use. So there are a bunch of people who worked on this project, but particularly thanks to Natural England and the Tree Council for funding it. I figured out how to stop sharing. But yeah, so I feel a little bit like an imposter in this region, but my experience is more in terms of that large scale landscape dynamics and how we could potentially use that to help reduce the impacts of climate change, reduce the impacts of flooding, and inform other practices in the future.
Thank you, Josh. And we'll be joined by our last panelist now, who's Abs. Abs, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, John. I am Abhishek, or Abs for short, and I'm a first-year PhD researcher at the University of Exeter. And I saw some people being from sunny Cornwall in the chat, so I'm based in the Cornwall campus of University of Exeter. And I just started off in September last year, so I've been going through a lot of work of Pippa and Sofia. And Josh, I should look at your work as well soon. But if I share my screen with a couple interesting pictures. So the broad topic of my research, when it was pitched to me, was forgotten forests, uncovering the value of woody features in Cornish landscapes. And I've been in Cornwall for around 3 years, and I came from a master's in conservation and then worked as a biodiversity officer for the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. And that's where I first encountered these structures of stone with trees and bushes on them. And the picture on the right is a little earth bank at the bottom of our campus, and noticed it every day walking up to campus. I was very curious about the structure. I got in touch with a local organization called the Cornwall Rural Education and Skills Trust, who spoke to me about Cornish hedges and said very clearly, Cornish hedges are not hedgerows, but they have hedgerows on top of them. So it was quite a fascinating structure that I was introduced to. And because my background was in interdisciplinary research back in India, looking at how nature interacts with people and the role of community conservation, I think the Cornish hedge became of interest for me as an object that sort of was between people and nature in a way. So for this research, what I'm specifically looking at is roots inside Cornish hedges. So like I mentioned, the Cornish hedge is a structure of earth, and then there's different styles of stone architecture that you find outside on the banks of the hedges. And if you go around Cornwall, you will see different types of stone structures based on the type of stone that's available locally. And the interesting thing is that over time, these hedges become home for nature. And like this picture in this slide, this is a set of Cornish hedges on our Penryn campus, and they've got tons of trees on top of them as well. So my intention with this research is to look at how nature interacts with this object, which has a very unique heritage aspect to it as well. It's very locally unique in Cornwall, and Cornish hedging has been listed as an endangered craft as well. So there is work happening locally with trying to revive this culture of building Cornish hedges. So the picture on the top on this slide was me doing an introductory hedge building course with the Cornwall Rural Education and Skills Trust. And it was fascinating trying to stick stones together and make sure that the structure is sound. So what I'm particularly interested in now is how do roots distribute themselves inside these structures? And regarding the theme of today's panel discussion, understanding what are the technologies that can help us understand what's happening inside the hedges. So I'll be exploring remote sensing technologies like radar to look at how roots are distributed inside the hedges. My supervisors, Karen and Caitlin, based here on this campus as well, bring two very different aspects, with Karen bringing in the remote sensing and understanding how vegetation is distributed in the UK. So sort of that angle, with Caitlin's understanding of heritage and how we can preserve it for the future. We are hoping to sort of bring those two topics together in this project. So thank you so much. And I've been learning a little bit of Cornish, and I will say morass, which is thank you in Cornish. And if you'd like to follow my journey through this PhD, you can look at my forgottenforests.phd Instagram page, where I try to post as regularly as possible all the new things, new experiences that I have with my research.
Thank you, Abs. So if you take that screen down, and if we can be joined by everybody, we will get on to some questions. So just in case people aren't aware, I should have said at the beginning, but I always get distracted. But well, I was actually distracted by the fact that Pippa had disappeared, which slightly threw me off my game. I'm John Stokes. I'm Director of Tree Science and Research at the Tree Council. Tree Council is the umbrella organisations for tree groups across the UK, and we work in partnership with all sorts of organisations. I also have the privilege, and have had the privilege for the last 10 years, of chairing a group called HedgeLink, which is the sort of national group of hedgerow experts and hedgerow people. And so hedges are my passion, particularly, as those of you who do know me, the trees in those hedgerows. So I have a bit of skin in this game as well, and we will uncover some of that as we go through the rest of the conversation. The plan originally was that we had a whole load of questions that I'd thought of, and then we were going to open up to public questions. But the public questions are probably better than mine, so I'm going to go with a mixture of the both. We heard from all of you in that. In those openers, actually, what I was going to ask is the first question: why you wanted to explore hedges, and it feels like it's a bit of happenstance, luck, passion, joy from all of you. But as somebody who's been in this space for a long time, that idea that hedges are becoming a more interesting research area, do you think that's true? Do you think that there are more of you researching the topic than there used to be? Does it feel like a growth area, or does it feel like you're all a bit niche in your own particular and lovely ways? Just what do you think?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, John. And like I said, 10 years ago, when I started looking at hedgerows, the focus really had been on above ground biodiversity, like bats and bees and insects. And that really had been where nearly all the research had been done. And it's quite funny, I was at a conference a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, and Sofia will know this, at the same time that we were looking at hedgerows, just like you said, John, we suddenly found that lots of other people are looking at hedgerows, and these were teams in Germany and Ireland and France. So it wasn't just here in the UK, you know, the temperate regions of North Europe have traditionally again have hedgerows, these man-made features, like someone said, that have been used to divide up fields and boundaries for keeping livestock in, are common across other areas of Europe. And it was interesting that, again, yeah, a lot more research was being done. But like Sofia said, several countries in Europe had also, I suppose, in the last 10 years, set targets for hedgerow planting, particularly for climate change mitigation and perhaps adaptation as well, which we might touch on later. And I think these targets, and also not just for climate change, but for biodiversity as well, you know, people realizing their role in biodiversity. And I think perhaps by setting these targets, people suddenly thought, well, how much do we know about hedgerows? And I think that perhaps sort of spurred on the research. And it's great to see more research. While it might be quite niche, there is definitely more research going on.
Well, that's good to hear, because obviously people don't necessarily, you know the drivers behind research protocols. So it's good to hear that it feels like that. Pippa, do the rest of you don't have to answer if you want to add anything to what Pippa said on that one. Anybody else want to come in?
Yeah, I could just add to it quickly. From my perspective, being a more flood person, I think it's great how there's been this new drive towards making space for water and understanding how we can use natural ways to reduce flood risk through different agricultural practices, including planting hedgerows. So for me, it's really interesting from a different perspective to see how the growth in kind of flood management and sediment management has changed in response to kind of new research into hedgerows or new research into trees, where previously we wouldn't really have thought of it. We've moved from a state of kind of flood defense focused, and now we're trying to do a more holistic catchment based approach, and hedgerows are a big part of landscapes in Northern Europe. So it's great to see more research done in them and how we can include them in the future.
Sofia, anything else, or are you happy to move on?
They covered most things, and maybe leading on to the next topic, that it's not, we have opportunities now to study hedges at scales that we haven't been able to do previously. And so that really offers the possibility to a lot of researchers that may not be in traditional fields, in fields that traditionally looked at hedgerows, to start looking at these elements. So look at it, that's exactly what Josh started doing, for example, and he brought all this knowledge that that we were missing, and was able to apply it using new technologies in order to give us new insights that otherwise would be extremely resource intensive to gain at that scale.
And Josh, there have been a number of questions that have been coming in asking, can they use your method? How do they get your method? Where can they see your method? Can they use it to inform their local authority local nature recovery strategies? And I know one of those that asked that is James, who's in Herefordshire. He's the sort of coordinator of a lot of tree activities for the county council over there. So is there a way that other people can get access to your method? Is it replicable?
Yep, absolutely. It's replicable. There's an open access paper that I'll put the DOI in the chat in a minute, that anyone can access. The thing that's not accessible is our data that we use to train the model, and that's just because of licensing restrictions. So if anyone's interested in working on it, then happy to have a chat about it and see how we can work together to build that. But everything is open access, for everything in terms of the method, is open access for people to go and replicate should they wish. Okay,
fantastic, thank you. And then other questions were coming up about how hedges can help in the where was it? It was biodiversity net gain. What was that? Does the panel? So the question went like this: hedges are linear. This is from Paul. Hedges are linear woodlands, often offer so much value, particularly for water recycling, carbon and things. Does the panel think that BNG will help or hinder hedgerow restoration? Don't know if you want to, I never know whether people want to answer these or not, so go for it. Anybody?
Yeah, so obviously talking about biodiversity net gain, which, if you're, I think there was a few actual sort of comments or questions about, house building and things. So obviously if we're going to use land for house building and they have to remove hedges, then there's a requirement for them now to plant hedges elsewhere or on the estate, so they can choose what they do. So I suppose obviously we don't really want to destroy hedges. I mean, and especially if they're ancient hedgerows and have been there for a long time, they've got a lot of diversity. But I suppose we do need houses, and so there's this sort of conflict, I suppose, about maybe destroying some, but then BNG makes sure that you replace these hedgerows by planting new ones, and at a much higher rate than the amount you destroyed. So that's a good thing, I suppose. So there is value in that. But I think I saw a bit of a question. I've looked at a few, so I'll keep going, because obviously there's diversity that you might have destroyed, and to ensure you get diversity in the new hedgerow, we need to make sure that we plant a range of species, so not just one or two. And I'll let others talk about that, but I think it's really critical that we do look at multiple species, at least 5 or 6 different species. We're looking at climate change occurring and things like this. So I think there's opportunity for planting hedgerows, but there's lots of opportunities of planting hedgerows, not just BNG. There's an awful lot, so which is great.
Sophia, I can't remember, it was you that looked at the age of which the hedge became biodiversity valuable, didn't you? So do you want to just tell people a bit about that?
Yes, so the main way at which we looked at biodiversity within our project was to try to harvest the power of these new technologies to collect data that we were not physically able to collect ourselves. So what we did was to deploy some field recorders called Audimos. They're portable, small recorders that are fairly cheap. And we place them in hedgerows of different ages. And then we use machine learning to identify the bird calls and the bat calls that were present in this thousands and thousands of hours of recording that we collected over the span of 6 weeks. And the purpose of the exercise was to try to get an idea of the time frame that it takes for the activity. So we're not really talking about species richness here, but we're talking about the vocal activity of birds and of bats, which is correlated to their abundance and to how good of for example, of a foraging habitat a hedgerow can be. And that data essentially showed that it takes about 10 years for a hedgerow to really show an amount of activity that is comparable to that of a much more mature hedgerows. But of course, so our comparison were mature hedgerows that were planted around 50 years ago. They were not ancient hedgerows, so it's really important to stress the fact that if a hedgerow has been there for hundreds of years, it probably acts as a refuge for species that otherwise are really limited in their habitats. So we should really pay extra attention when it comes to these really rich hotspots. And I'm sure that APS actually has a good idea of that as well. But essentially, our study showed it took around 10 years. So it's a considerable amount of time, that's for sure.
Considerable amount of time, but not necessarily too long a period of time. That's the interesting.
No. If we actually started planting hedgerows widely and manage them correctly, so that somebody actually pointed it out in the chat, it's always an important thing. If we plant a hedge and then we just let it die out, then what's the point of that? But we could actually potentially see some real benefits in the span of a decade.
I know. Thank you. Abs, a question came in from where was the question that came in? I've forgotten who it's from now, and I like to try and credit them where possible. But it was a question about whether being a Cornish hedge with a wall structure, whether that might change the nature of the biodiversity, the species association, rather than enhancing it. I'm sorry, whoever asked the question, I've lost your name. I think, but what do you think?
Yes, no, that is, I think the crux of my research as well is where is that tipping point between the structure actually interacting negatively with trees and tree roots as well. So what I will hope to look at is that there must be techniques in a way that the built structure of the hedge itself can be preserved, because what we have seen is if the traditional practices of coppicing trees is not done regularly, what can happen is the weight of the tree on top, if at risk from wind, for example, will sort of fall and then take the stone structure of the hedge with it as well. So there is an interesting aspect where people engaging with the hedge and managing the tree structures on them, for example, does play a big part in, specifically to Cornish hedges, maintaining their structure as well. And then brings up questions of, okay, how can we do the management in a way that we don't severely destroy the biodiversity on the hedge as well? So definitely, I think the stone structure brings in an interesting angle of how we can manage these structures. But also there are Cornish hedges with wildflowers as the main thing growing on the hedge structure. So it almost becomes a living wall system. So I think connecting back to that biodiversity net gain question, if we start designing our backyards with Cornish hedges down in Cornwall, for example, you could promote this vertical aspect of smaller plants that grow on the hedges that will help with pollination and with microclimate as well in your own backyard.
I'm sorry, that was Brian Cook that asked the question. He said, he also asked whether it's restricted to Devon and Cornwall that you have these walls type structures. And certainly I've seen them in Normandy. I've seen walls, there's a few in Brittany, there's a few in Normandy. But I think it is largely in a British context. It's this intriguing mixture of the stone walls of Yorkshire and a hedge. It's this weird mixture that And I've never worked out which came first, the stone wall or the hedge, because obviously the hedges were there 4,000 years ago, the Cornish ones. But I don't know which came first, whether somebody removed the soil and couldn't be bothered to fill it up with plants when they built them in Yorkshire, or whether they took the idea and added them into it in other places in the country. Perhaps one that you might get an answer to eventually, Abs, when you get to the other end of the...
Definitely, you're very right. I think the structure as it is present, I think, has been described as a field boundary of an ancient countryside in a way. And I think the reason it has lasted in Cornwall for a long time is because of where it's geographically set. I think archaeologists have sort of speculated that what would happen is when you start building settlements and farmland, you dig up rocks which are sort of at the surface and you start piling them on the side. I think that dry stone wall concept would have come from a similar place as well. But I'm guessing what happened, at least in Cornwall and Devon, is that including that earth bank as sort of the central part of the stone structure is what makes it more biodiverse as well, is what allows plants to grow on top of this structure. So I'm guessing, I mean, the ones that have survived so far are still mainly Devon, Cornwall, and like you said, in Normandy as well. So if I'm not wrong, with sort of Roman history as well as enclosure acts is where a lot of the planted hedgerows were introduced in most of the UK. So I will be interested to see what that history has been as well.
The archaeologists tell us that the oldest field systems in the country are around, if you've never been, they're around Zena in Cornwall. And those Zena hedges, stone walls, are deemed to be about 4,000 years old. So that's the thing that never ceases to amaze me when you think about hedges, that some of them, whether they be stone walls or biological lines of plants, might have been in this bit of the landscape for up to 4,000 years. I do still find that jaw-droppingly astonishing. We've had various questions, Abs, taking your thing about the tree, the tree component of the hedge tearing out the structure of the wall. We've got some questions that have been coming in about hedgerow trees and the importance of hedgerow trees, and so many questions have come in that I've lost the one. It was a really nice one about the importance of hedgerow trees and whether they provided good biodiversity, whether the components have been looked at, and what the component elements of the biodiversity of a hedge are they're in the hedgerow trees. And something that we, Tree Council, commissioned Forest Research to look at about 10 years ago was to actually just try to establish the component value of a hedgerow tree in the mix. And it was huge. And the way it ended up being articulated was that the tree is basically the motorway service station of the hedgerow network, that insects migrating along hedges stopped in the trees as the third vertical component, the big bit in the way, and they'd use them as sort of stepping stones across the hedgerow network, across the landscape. And the importance of the tree therefore could not be overstated, because they provided this sort of structure that the hedge didn't always provide. A bit of height, something for them to intercept, particularly things like bats. So the hedgerow tree component biologically is genuinely important, and the methodology of managing that is still something that we haven't quite cracked. Anybody else want to add anything on hedgerow trees?
Wow. Yes, and I've got a question as well for Josh about hedgerow trees. No, I think, hedgerow trees are really important, and just, well, you've outlined one reason, John, but we think about climate change and livestock and shade. Hedgerow trees obviously provide much more shade and shelter for livestock, and there are ways of introducing trees into hedgerows in your management cycle of your hedgerows. And I think people in the chat have acknowledged that hedgerows are a man-made feature and therefore need managing. And the reasons perhaps why hedgerows are can become in a poor state are because they're either overmanaged or not managed at all. And some of you may be familiar with the terms laying and coppicing, and this is the way we rejuvenate hedgerows. And when we come to lay hedgerows, there are opportunity to perhaps keep some of the larger species to grow as trees, particularly if it's maybe field maple or a crabapple tree or something like that, you know, that can grow taller and form a hedge tree and increase our hedge trees. And I suppose I had a question for Josh, was maybe could your technology, where you've identified gaps, could you use similar technology to identify hedge trees?
Sorry, I'm wrestling with the unmute button. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are colleagues around the world who have got algorithms to identify trees, and we can link that in with data that we've got to see if they're a hedgerow tree or not a hedgerow tree. So there's lots of cool data available that we can do stuff with. I guess it's just finding these questions to answer what people are actually interested in. And it'd definitely be something that's interesting to explore, especially the connectivity between trees in different environments to different hedgerow. One of the things that I wanted to look at, but we ran out of time, was the width of the hedgerow itself. But that was a little bit beyond the project that we were doing. And I'm sure, as everyone in this call is aware, funding can sometimes be it's great when you get it, but you're not guaranteed to get it right.
We did that same bit of research we did with Forest Research a few years ago, suggested that we needed to plant as many as 15,000 new hedgerow trees into the population each year, because there was a mismatch between the age class distribution. There were about 80% of the trees were over 80 years old, and there were almost no recruitment coming into the population, and that is not a population that's going to survive, you know, in the long term.
I think that's a really good point, John. Obviously, ash trees, unfortunately, you know, which are a major tree in hedgerows, have suffered greatly through ash dieback, and obviously as well through storms, you know, more frequent storms. The rate of loss of hedgerow trees is much larger than the rate of new hedgerow trees. So I think it is really important to encourage hedgerow trees where we can. And obviously sometimes farmers aren't so keen, perhaps, particularly in arable areas where they might see hedgerow trees as potentially impacting on crop yield or taking water and things like that. But there are ways, and agroforestry is also a way of introducing trees into our agricultural landscape. So there are other ways, not just trees in hedgerows, but more broadly about trees on farms.
Chash asked a question earlier, which basically echoed one of the ones I was going to ask you, but we may as well use theirs as they've asked it. They said, it's a bit of a devil's advocate question, but of course the destruction of habitat and loss of any ecological benefit is always detrimental. But considering hedges were always and have always been a man-made habitat designed in order to, you know, demarcate ownership of land, what alternative approaches or innovative solutions have you thought of that might be able to replace a hedge? Anybody?
This question made me immediately think of the first slide that Megan Gimber, I don't know if from the Council for Endangered Species, John.
Yes, she's from yes,
People's Trust for Endangered Species.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And she always has this amazing, she does a lot of public outreach about hedges, and she has this first slides when talking about the history of hedgerows that exemplifies how hedgerows used to be essentially the remnant of the shrubland that used to exist in all over agriculture. Well, it wasn't an agricultural era yet, all over Europe around 10,000 years ago. And then as humans started to create fields, hedgerows were the shrubland that was pushed to the side of these fields. And so it's really hard in the context of European landscapes to separate hedgerows and as a man-made structure from their semi-natural habitat provision. I don't think that you can really do that. Now, of course, you could You could go into quite drastic and substantial changes to the agricultural landscape. That means reducing essentially the amount of agricultural land that we have and rewilding. But we all know that that is not really feasible, especially in the context of the UK, where there is not that much land available, and we do need food security. And hedgerows, because they lay at the edge of the fields, they present this really nice compromise in a way. So I would argue that you can't really replace a hedge, and you should, because so many species will always have been relying on them for such a long time.
And indeed, when they've tried it with wire in other parts of the world, in the Americas, for example, or in North America, when they put in wire fencing, the birds have landed on the posts, and that's been the way that the hedges have been created. It's true in Canada. Lots of hedges have been created because the other systems encourage things to land on them and drop seed, and that effectively creates you a hedge anyway. So I think nature will out eventually. There will always be that. If the land is unused, nature will always get in and do something with it, and that will probably end up being some form of scrubland.
Yeah, and just to add one last thing, even if, so I live in the context of Denmark now, and they've gone through that transition now of saying that 15% of the agricultural land has to be taken out of agricultural production and be planted with trees. You still need hedgerows, so because this habitats otherwise, these wooded habitats end up being isolated. So hedgerows, you can't replace their function as corridors. They are just essential in the landscape.
Anybody else want to add anything on that one?
I think that was beautifully covered. Yeah.
So Zoe's just asked, and there's so many questions that I've lost track. If you had a brilliant question, everybody, and I've missed it, I apologize. But Zoe's just asked one, which is, and if you want to, and you're thinking my burning question, he's not done it, just repost it, because I'll have missed it in the hundreds of them that have come through. Just is there a way in which we can increase the collaboration between farmers and use the agricultural systems to do that? And I'll speak from a not being in the DEFRA policy bit, but knowing what they're up to. There is definitely aspirations to join together networks of farmers across landscapes, across to try and use more hedges. DEFRA now has its, for the first time in my 35 years of doing this, DEFRA now has a policy unit dealing with the hedgerow policy, which is fantastic. And the team there are doing some really good work. So there is definitely a hope. Bits of research like Josh is looking at the holes where you can target your plantings to fill in the gaps. These things start to become really important. Sofia's research that says that 10 years is the point at which biodiversity starts to really, really be significant and starts to get back to the place where it might, and that's helping to fill in those gaps. So we know we can do it. But lots of people have been commenting on the quality of the hedge behind you, Pippa, and the fact that it's untrimmed and unmanaged, and how do we get people to get into that state? And all of these are parts of the future that we need to explore. Just
there's many ways, and I think we've already mentioned Megan, but there are other people out there and groups out there that do hedge events and working with farmers to, I suppose, get over these messages. Farmers are guardians of these hedgerows, and many of them are very proud of their hedgerows and how they manage them. And it's just sort of getting farmers to be, to spread the word, really. It's that. And yes, while the hedgerow behind me is looking lovely with the hawthorn blossom, and that shows it hasn't been trimmed for a few years. We do need to trim hedges, but perhaps not as frequently, like every year, that some farmers have been doing. So it's, there's the Healthy Hedge app that's out there that can help farmers manage their hedgerows. And that is also available on paper copy. If you put Healthy Hedge app in, you'll find all about it. And there's information about laying hedgerows. And yes, the government until recently had a sustainable farming initiative where there were options around hedgerow management, to reduce how often you trim your hedgerows, to encourage hedgerow trees, to assess the structure of your hedgerows. And there were capital grants to lay your hedgerow, to coppice it, to provide fencing if you have livestock. So there were many ways which farmers could draw on finances. There are also obviously private schemes, and many supply chains support their farmers to plant more hedgerows. And DEFRA, I'm sure, will reinstate the Sustainable Farm Initiative, hopefully in a later time this year or next year. And I think hedgerows will still be supported through it, but they're obviously going through a bit of a change, and let's hope hedgerows are seen as a priority, and obviously because we do have a target to meet to improve planting and filling up the gaps that Josh highlighted. There are a lot of gaps in our hedgerows, and even if we fill up those, we'll be doing a lot towards meeting our planting targets.
Pippa, Anna's asked whether you could just give a little bit of Kate's asked whether you could just give a little bit of detail of what happened to the soil under the hedge.
Oh yes, sure. Yeah, so all of you that are interested in soil, so often I'm talking to farmers about how to improve their soil health, and one of the ways I do this is take a spade and take some soil from their field, and we look at the soil colour and the soil structure in the field, and then we take some soil from under the hedgerow and look at the soil colour and the structure and the smell. I do like it to smell my soil, as you remember, John.
I do. It's probably my abiding memory of Pippa, which should always be my abiding, was seeing Pippa digging up and sniffing handfuls of soil across the field. It was genuinely fabulous moment. Sorry.
I always say good wine. You like to smell your wine. Soil, good soil has a good smell. Anyway, the soil under the hedgerows will nearly always be darker because it's storing more organic carbon. And if you compare that to the field where it's been managed and ploughed and cultivated, it loses some of that carbon, and generally has a lighter colour. So the colour, I think, is the really thing that you can see most about it. But you can also see the structure, the way in which the soil particles are held together. And if you want to smell the soil, the soil under the hedgerow will smell much nicer than the hedgerow, than the soil in the field. Often, usually, depends. But yes, so soil under our hedgerows store a lot more carbon than our agricultural fields, and it gives you an idea of what the soil could look like. But we'll never reach that endpoint within an agricultural field because we haven't got all the carbon turnover and input from the roots and the litter.
Have you found anything with the soils in your walls, in your Cornish hedges, Abs?
I was just going to say I should go to the next hedge building thing and go sniff the soil as well. But although I'm focusing on root architecture, and I think bringing that idea back of how do the roots interact with the hedge wall structure itself, hopefully that'll give us sort of new ideas for how we can detect roots inside Cornish hedges and understand biomass and how that contributes to carbon as well. So that is not my focus in my study, but definitely it'll be interesting to see how soil structure and soil carbon is inside the Cornish hedge itself, because I think similar to what Pippa said, and reading some of Pippa and Sofia's papers, there would likely be a lot of biological processes happening inside the hedge and then in the soil below the hedge as well, potentially.
We've talked largely about rural hedgerows, but there have been a number of questions about urban hedges that have come in, and the importance of the sort of heights and widths and forms of hedges, and whether that affects the biodiversity, and what you should do to try and maximize your urban hedgerow. So anybody got any thoughts in that space?
I think it's a great question, because my view, and I don't know what others feel, is that we perhaps have focused more on research on agricultural hedgerows and perhaps don't know so much about urban hedgerows, and that's perhaps an area where research could go in the future. So I said earlier, I did have an undergraduate student looking at green infrastructure in Leeds.
Oh.
I know. I think it happened again.
Pippa's laptop may have melted just before we get the
I
answer.
can pick up from there because I know
Nice,
who
okay.
he's referring to. And yes, we have a project that's looking at urban biodiversity, because that's always treated a bit as a separate environment in our disciplines. Really, there's the researchers that deal with rural landscapes, and then researchers that deal with urban landscapes. But I think that a lot of the principles that apply to hedgerows in the rural setting would also apply in the urban setting, with the added disturbance and maybe also the added pressure for a hedgerow to be looking a certain way, to perform different functions. So we don't know a whole lot. I believe there's some work done on maybe some aspects of biodiversity from an insect's point of view, for example, and from a bird point of view, of course, because bird nest in hedgerows. But sometimes also the regulations around cutting hedges might be different when you're in an urban setting, and that can have negative impacts on the biodiversity aspects that are linked to them. So we're just talking about this with Pippa a couple of days ago. It would be really interesting to go look a bit more about what species might function and in a more native and sort of have a more native role in an urban landscape, because at the moment a lot of the species that we plant maybe are not really at all representative of UK habitats, and maybe there's some work that we can do in that direction as well, to also to inform people about what they could do to support native species.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm going to just ask Josh and Abs a sort of follow on from that thought process. So if Sophia's saying that urban hedges are a definite area for new research, what would be your two choices for other bits of research that you think we need to do on hedges going forward? Josh first.
For me, I think it's about how we can work with community groups and individuals to inform some of the large-scale landscape dynamic aspects of things. So whether that's through pictures of hedgerows to monitor their health in different environments, all the way through to kind of the artificial intelligence, deep learning side of things, and kind of really generating a rich data set and understanding of how these different species vary across climates. So we can work towards building this huge database that anyone can access to inform their local hedgerow management. I think for me, that would be a really big thing.
Fantastic. And Abs, last point, and then we're going to close.
Yes, I think connecting both Sophia and Josh's point is, I can see a Cornish hedge being used as a boundary for a house in front of my place right now. So I think it brings up that conversation of bringing this object as something that people engage with, making it not just a solution in agricultural lands for farmers to deal with, and turning it into a nature-based solution. And that can actually help people look at the hedge every day almost. And I think the interesting thing will be to understand how plants in a hedge in your backyard might help with your local microclimate, and what species make your backyard their home then. And sort of in a way, it brings people closer to nature as well.
And thank you all for a really good conversation. We've barely scratched the number of questions and comments and thoughts that came in, and I apologize if you've produced a brilliant question and I've missed it. We will look at those that we can and try and provide some feedback if we particularly missed anything. Thank you all for your engagement. This is the first of our National Hedgerow Week events this week. There's another one on Thursday, which is dealing with hedgerow trees and ash dieback and the impact that might have in the landscape. And my colleagues will post in the chat in a second how you can see that one. And then on Friday, we're talking about the nature of HedgeLink, which is the group that works together. And you heard Sophia mention Megan and others. They will be there talking about their vision for hedges for the future and how we collectively see it from an environmental charities and an environmental organisations groups. So please do join us for either of those. Thank you so much for attending today. We hope you found it an interesting conversation. Thank you to all our researchers, and thank you to Pippa in absentia, because she has had complete meltdown of the kit. we will pass on our thanks to her on all of your behalf. Thank you all for joining us today, and see you hopefully at one of the others later in the week. And thank you all for being our panel today. You were extremely helpful. Thank you all.